Welcome back everybody to Metaphysics. We're continuing talking about ontology, and in this video we're going to start to talk about the method, specifically the Quinean method, for establishing ontological commitments. So this is going to be an uncovering essentially of the metaphysical process of discovering and acquiring ontological commitments. Now, there are various processes by which an ontological commitment can be established, but what we're going to be doing is, because of course we're talking about the most famous, most pertinent, and most impactful of the philosophers in this area, we'll examine the Quinean method for establishing ontological commitments in this video, and then talk about it in relation to one of the subsidiary elements of the ontological commitments method in the next video, which is this idea of the use of paraphrase, the method of paraphrase as a mode by which ontological commitments can be established. So we've seen already from the previous lessons that what Quine does is reject the argument for the existence of non-existent entities. Okay, so what do we mean by this? So if we were to see the sentences like Santa does not exist, we're talking about the acceptance of a proposition, this proposition Santa not being in existence, but there is a rejection on the part of Quine for the argument of the existence of the non-existent entity in this example being something like Santa. So we would still accept the sentence, Santa does not exist. The proposition has meaning still, and it is still a truth statement that can be made. But the actual subject matter of this statement, the idea of the non-existent entity being Santa, does not exist. So Santa does not exist is still a true proposition, but the non-existent entity that is included within this proposition, the argument for the existence of said entity, is rejected by Quine. Now, you can understand, on the other hand, however, why people may accept the existence of this non-existent entity in some kind of way, because of course the argument being here is that we can sort of intuitively understand this sentence to be true. And so if this proposition is true, this sentence is true, then does this suggest, therefore, that it has some kind of meaning attached to it? If that is the case, then does this suggest that the meaning, that the idea of meaning is attached to some kind of existence when it comes to the entities in which we are talking about? And then you can sort of wrap some logical argumentation around that to come to the conclusion, essentially, that Santa, being an entity, actually does exist, but does not exist in the same sense that we're talking about in this proposition. All of these things have been talked about in previous lessons. So, according to Quine, just because this proposition is true, and just because this proposition therefore has meaning, owing to the fact that it is true, this does not mean that one must be ontologically committed to the existence of something like Santa. And so the result here is that Quine attempts to establish a view which allows you to have the best of both worlds, essentially. You can accept the meaningfulness and the truth value of a statement like this, while also rejecting the existence of the non-existent entity, i.e. the entity being that of Santa. So you can have a situation where you can accept the proposition's truth value without having to be ontologically committed to the existence of something that we know to be not non-existing. How does Quine do this? How does Quine present this argument? Well, he does so through this idea of ontological commitment. And what he does is uses first-order logic to find the location of and the clear delineation of an ontological commitment. This is a process which Quine calls regimentation. So when we talk about the process of taking a sentence and putting it into first-order logic to discover where one's ontological commitments may exist, Quine calls this regimenting a proposition, or regimenting some kind of idea, which is to the extent to which they want to be ontologically committed to it. So let's take the proposition. If we take S to mean Santa as some kind of entity, let's take the proposition and Santa does not exist, and we can translate this into first order logic, and we find the following sentence. What does this mean? Well, the reversed E that we see here is actually what is known as a quantifier. It is known as an existential quantifier. In first order logic, there are two main quantifiers. You have an existential quantifier and you have a universal quantifier. What the existential quantifier tells us here is that the reverse E next to the letter X is that there exists some X. And then the next part here is that this X is identical to S. So there exists some X that is S, that is the same as Santa, okay? But the thing is, there is a little squiggle at the start of this here. If we look here, this is a negation sign. So what this is telling us is that you have to take this entire proposition, you have to take this entire first order set, this first order language, and you have to negate that language. You have to come to the conclusion that the opposite is true. So essentially what this is telling us is there does not exist some X and that this variable is Santa. So that there is a variable, some kind of entity that is the S, that means Santa, and it does not exist. So this sentence here in first order logic is identical semantically and syntactically to the sentence that we have above, which is the sentence that Santa does not exist. We have regimented that proposition. The sentence is clearly meaningful, but at the same time does not make any claims to the existence of an object. In fact, it makes the exact opposite claim. It tells us that there does not exist. There is a negation of the proposition that the Santa exists. And so what we're saying here is we have a meaningful proposition, but we're still ontologically committed to the rejection of the existence of some kind of non-existent entity, i.e. that being Santa. So this is really where we get this idea of negating the sentence and how important negation of this sentence actually is. But one could ask, what about the word Santa itself? Because essentially what this is doing is rejecting the proposition that Santa exists. It is suggesting that there does not exist some X that is Santa. But what about the S? We've just assumed that S equals Santa in this particular sentence. And so what does the symbol Santa, the S, represent? Well, it represents the word Santa. But does this suggest, therefore, that the S in this proposition, that the S variable, or the S constant, as it would be described in first order logic, also still has some kind of meaning attached to it? Well, the answer here is that if this is the case, and if S still has meaning, then Quine actually hasn't changed anything. In fact, Quine actually draws upon the work of Bertrand Russell to try and come around this distinction, okay? To try and get over this kind of problem. Because while he has suggested that the proposition Santa does not exist in and of itself has meaning while still does not require us to be ontologically committed to the existence of an entity that is Santa, and he does so by regimenting that proposition into first order logic, as we have seen here, he still has the problem of trying to represent the specific variables within the first order logic sentence in which he has regimented, potentially having meaning to this. And so he looks to the work of Bertrand Russell to try and make this distinction. He claims here that names are simply definite descriptions, okay? So Quine takes the view, Quine takes the sentence, for example, Pegasus does not exist, and we can express this as there does not exist some X that is that we can then therefore represent as being the Pegasus. So one of the things here is we're looking at the idea of a name being a definite description, which is something that Bertrand Russell establishes when he derived a lot of his writings in the philosophy of language. Now, for those of you who want to see more videos on the philosophy of language, we will be getting to that in future lessons time, where we will spend quite a good amount of time discussing and examining Bertrand Russell's theories on the philosophy of language. But ultimately, therefore, first order logic is actually quite useful. It can be very useful in finding a system by which we can essentially have our own ontological commitments, and that we can defend our own ontological commitments quite easily. Simply, we can regiment a sentence into first order logic, and with that translation, we can see that we can find the ontological commitments to existences. Take, for example, the following sentence: electrons exist. Is this regimentable into first order logic? Absolutely. It can be translated quite easily into the following proposition. It suggests that there exists some X, and that the X that exists is an electron. This is known as a predicate. The large capital E is a predicate. It is a characteristic that we assign to the variable. So the variable is assigned the characteristic of being an electron, and that there exists some some X that is this electron. Therefore, this is representative both semantically and syntactically of the first sentence here, electrons exist. It tells us, like I said, that there exists some X, and X has the characteristic of being an electron, being E. Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in metaphysics. In this penultimate lesson on the subject of ontology, what I'm going to do is talk about Quine's method of paraphrase. Now, this is a continuation, just an additional element to the broader conversation that we have been having about ontological commitments and the process by which Quine develops ontological commitments within the broader realm of metaphysics. We've been talking about Quine's theories of ontological commitment, and this lesson we're going to talk about one of the elements relating to essentially the idea of ontology and the idea of ontological commitment, which is this method of paraphrase. What does the method of paraphrase entail for us as philosophers? Well, it looks a little bit like this. We have three basic steps that we can think about when it comes to the establishment of ontological commitments, examining and trying to come to conclusions about which sentences you take to be true. The first step is as follows. You decide which sentences you take to be true. Now, one of the things that's very interesting here, and as a point that we need to remember, is that the subject of ontology in the day-to-day life is sort of done after we have concluded the value of sentences that we believe to be true. We don't tend to have an agnostic approach towards the truth value of sentences until we have subjected that sentence through the rigorous process of ontological commitments. Rather, we have sentences that we believe to be true, and then we try and post hoc justify the truth value of those sentences by talking about ontology. So that is a sort of a backwards way of focusing on it, but of course this is the way that you would deal with things in day-to-day life. So part one is to decide which sentences you take to be true. Part two is to then regiment those sentences by converting them into first-order logic, and then by doing so you have dealt with this issue of regimentation. And then the third part is to commit yourself to all and to only those entities needed to stand in as the values of the bound variables in order to make those sentences true. So this is this third point is, or at least the 3 points here are exemplified and elucidated specifically by Elisa Ney's textbook. So fundamentally, what does this third point mean? Well, essentially what we have is we have a sentence which we take to be true. It is regimented into first-order logic, and then when we look at it through the lens of first-order logic, we see a truth statement, we see a truth value, we see a true sentence, okay? And what Quine is telling us to do is to commit yourself to all of the entities that are a part of that sentence, which make that sentence true. Okay, that stand in as the values of the bound variables in order to make the sentence true. So remember, when we regiment a thing by converting it into first order logic, we essentially take bound variables, okay, as the, quote, stand-in values for the sentence that we try to have. So the sentence itself is written in English, but then when it is regimented into first-order logic, we have a number of different variables and we have a number of different predicates and connectives and quantifiers that we use to express that sentence. You assign yourself, you commit yourself to those entities which stand in as those values, which make that sentence true. Now, this is fundamentally the three-step process for which Quine develops his understanding of metaphysical and ontological commitment. And the question we have to think here is, does this mean that Quine suggests that one would have to be committed to such ontology if subjecting propositions to regimentation? And what he does to address this issue is use a zoological example. He uses the example of the following sentence. He says here that some zoological species are cross-fertile. Okay? This is a sentence that has a truth value, and so you would be perfectly valid and perfectly reasonable and perfectly correct to assign truth value to it and to commit yourself ontologically to the truth of this sentence. Let's then commit this to regimentation. Let's then convert it into first order logic. This is what this sentence looks like in first order logic. What does this sentence say? Well, we have the existential quantifier here, which says that for some x, we have Sx and Cx, okay? So, what does this tell us? It tells us that the variable x, okay, for some x, the variable x will be a species, and the variable x will be cross-fertile. C refers to cross-fertile as the predicate of the representation of cross-fertile, and S is the predicate of the representation of species. So for some x, x will be a species, and x will be cross-fertile. There will be some species that are cross-fertile. That is what this says. Okay, like I've just written here. This tells us there is some variable x, which is both Sx, which is both a zoological species, okay? It has the predicate of being a species, and Cx, which is the predicate of being cross-fertile. They will be both, okay? There will also be some that are not cross-fertile, hence why we don't have a universal quantifier, we have an existential quantifier. If it was a universal quantifier, then it would be incorrect, because then that would tell us that all zoological species are cross-fertile, which is obviously not true. So, continuing on then. This sentence commits us to the existence of species, if you look here, okay? And if we were to follow the Quinean method, the three-stage test that we have all the way up here, okay? We take a sentence, we decide a sentence which we take to be true, which is some zoological species are cross-fertile. I want to ontologically commit myself to that statement, okay? And in order to do so, I'm going to take it, I'm going to regiment it into first order logic, which is what I have done, and then what I'm going to do is take this first order logic sentence, and I'm going to commit myself to any of the entities which are represented in first order logic, which make that sentence true, which are the bound variables which make the sentence true, okay? So I have the sentence, step 1 is the top line, I've then regimented it, which is step 2, into first order logic, and now I am going to commit myself to all of those variables, to everything that is part of that sentence that makes that sentence true from a logical perspective, through first order logic. One of those things, however, is my ontological commitment to zoological species, to the existence of zoological species, because this is telling us that there is some x, and that some x will be a zoological species, and B, cross-fertile, both at the same time. That's why we have a conjunction. So this automatically means that we have to commit ourselves to not only the cross-fertility of some zoological species, but also to the existence of zoological species specifically. But then the question then is asked, the question that is then begged is, well, it commits us to the existence of zoological species, but which zoological species? How do we then go further? Well, because the problem we have now is that species, the idea of zoological species, the sort of taxonomy of species and the taxonomy of the animal kingdom, for example, is fundamentally an abstract concept. The idea of a cat or the idea of a dog. We have definitions of these things, but these are generally quite abstract. The word species and the word zoological species, while a little bit more specific than just species in and of itself, does not commit us to a specific existence of a specific thing. One may take a taxonomical view, where species are groups of types of animals. So we're not talking about an individual cat, we're talking about the taxonomy view. The taxonomical view wouldn't be representative of an individual cat or an individual dog, it would be of the category of cat, the category of dog, which is defined from a taxonomical perspective. So we define a cat as having whatever the characteristics of a cat is. This is similar to a set theoretic viewpoint, where species are essentially the set, where we have the set of all things that are cats, or the set of all things that are dogs, and then the entities that are represented therein are the individual cats, or the individual dogs. My dog Morgan, for example, is a specific dog, but it is not the set of all things that is dog, okay? She is a specific representation of an entity within that set. That's a set theoretical perspective. Well, fundamentally, Quine doesn't like any of these ideas, and so he objects to the existence of abstract entities, as we've already made reference to. So how does he reconcile this idea, that the idea of a species is an abstract entity? And so the method of paraphrase seems to, or at least this ontological commitments method, seems to seems to commit us to something that he doesn't want to commit himself to. Well, this is what the method of paraphrase essentially tries to get around. So, the proposition theoretically commits him to the existence of what would be described as an abstract entity, an abstract idea, a set of all things that we would describe as being a species. But Quine rejects this viewpoint. Instead, Quine either can reject the proposition or he can accept the existence of abstract entities, okay? So he can either reject the truth value of the statement, some zoological species are cross-fertile, or he can accept the existence of abstract entities. You can't do both, fundamentally, if you want to do this from this perspective at the moment, okay? And obviously, it doesn't seem to make sense to want to reject the proposition, given that it is something that you can and should be ontologically committed to. There are cross-fertile species. But if you're somebody who doesn't accept the existence of abstract entities, how can you do this? Well, what Quine suggests is that the process of regimenting the sentence from the English, from some zoological species are cross-fertile, to the first order logic for some x, sx, and cx, this commits one to paraphrase the sentence to avoid quantification over entities. So when he says that there are some species which are cross-fertile, okay, what he is simply doing is paraphrasing all the specific species, okay? And the point of reference that we have, therefore, is not necessarily got to do with the fact that we're talking about the species, we're talking about the idea of cross-fertility. It's a little bit of a slippery method. It's a little bit of a method that is debated, and I feel like I should go into it in more detail in future lessons' time. But for now, we'll just end on this view here on the method of paraphrase, and we will talk in the next lesson about the concept of meta-ontology before we finish and start moving on to the next major topic within the subject of metaphysics. Welcome back, everybody, to our study of metaphysics. In this final lesson on the subject of ontology, what I want to do is spend some time talking about the study of meta-ontology. We'll just talk a little bit about what meta-ontology is, the ways in which meta-ontology might help us understand the broader context of ontology generally, and then finish by examining something known as sparse ontology as well, a position of an ontological position. And we'll also look a little bit at the idea of Occam's razor as a method of ontological commitments. So, like I said, this is the final lesson on the subject of ontology. We're going to be moving on next to the subject of objects and properties in the next lessons. But for now, we will look at the concept of what is known as meta-ontology. And we will also finalize some of the subsidiary issues relating to ontological commitments. This is and has been something of a broad overview topic on the subject of ontology. I should make it very clear for reference that in the future we may well, very likely in fact, do a whole series of lessons on just the subject of ontology, and the various different approaches, commitments, histories, theories, and ideas as like a very advanced subject within metaphysics. That is likely going to be something that we do, but for now this topic in metaphysics is just going to be going through each of the major topics of metaphysics before we then go into the advanced subjects in later videos. So for now, we are just taking a broad overview of ontology, and so these lessons have tried to, insofar as possible, reflect that kind of approach. So, what do we mean when we talk about meta-ontology? What is meta-ontology? Well, meta-ontology, as the name suggests, is the study of how one conducts ontology. So it is the study of ontology, but the study of how one does ontology, essentially. And a view in ontology is a view about what things exist, what things we ought to be ontologically committed to, which statements we ought to be ontologically committed to. And we've been talking in a lot of ways about how, particularly the philosopher Quine, actually derives his principles for how he would approach how to understand what things ought to be an ontological commitment. This idea of regimentation, for example, the process of turning something into first order logic, and then where there are clashes and where there are where there are problems that may cause you to commit to things that you might not necessarily want to commit to in terms of existence, you may want to paraphrase, use a method of paraphrase, which is what the previous lesson examined. A view in meta-ontology, however, is a view about what one is doing or ought to be doing when they are engaging in an ontological debate. When we are talking about ontology, what ought to be the case, what ought one do, and how should this whole approach be tackled? In a similar way that when we talk about ethics and the subject of moral philosophy, we're talking often about how one ought to act in a certain situation, how one ought to be, what decisions one ought to make that are the most ethical decisions for them. But then a subject and a study of meta-ethics is a broader conversation that is not necessarily about specific instances of morality, but is more so talking about conversations in relation to what it means to say something is right or wrong, what it means to say something is moral or immoral, where does morality derive? All of these different things are meta-ethical debates. This is a meta-ontological debate, okay? So what we have been doing is the meta-ontology of the Quinian method of ontological commitments. That's essentially what the subject that we have been engaging ourselves in. But what we haven't been doing is necessarily ontology itself, but rather trying to find a system by which one can have ontological commitments. It's almost a normative ontology that we're doing, a theory of trying to develop a system of ontology and ontological commitments that we can then apply to any situation that we want to in terms of making decisions about what we believe to exist. So, given that this is what we've been doing, let's see if we can apply some of the Quinian principles to finding ontological commitments. Let's see if we can actually just finish off this series of lessons on ontology by doing something like this. Fundamentally, what is the correct way, should I say, to find sentences that one takes to be true? That is the question that I wish to ask here. What do we mean by this? Well, according to Quine, what we are looking for in ontology is similar to what we are looking for in science, in a similar sense. Okay, in science, what we are trying to do is search for good scientific theories, and one of the things that is useful in science is to try and make sure that these good scientific theories are simple. So, what do we mean when we talk about simplicity in terms of good scientific theories? Well, what Quine says is that taking the concept of simplicity is a very important part of the process of finding ontological commitments, okay? And he believes that we should start with what he would term the simplest conceptual scheme. And the reason for this is then you can then build up and build on to some of the more detailed and more difficult stuff that we can try and find ontological commitments for. You might be familiar with this idea. You might be familiar with this idea because what this idea is, trying to find the simplest conceptual scheme and the simplest explanation for events and things things taking place. This is Occam's razor, a theory developed by medieval philosopher and theologian William of Ockham. When it comes to the theories of approaching ontological commitments, okay, it is fundamentally Occam's razor is fundamentally an ontological tool that one may use to try and come to determinations about what the correct course of action is in terms of a belief system. So what Occam's razor essentially tells us, the theory of Occam's razor, simply states that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Okay. Now, this is in Latin, this particular phrase, in a lesson that I did on law over on the Law Academy a few days ago. I tried to read out some Latin and it failed dramatically, so I'm not even going to attempt to do this. I'm not Latin. I don't speak Latin. This is the Latin phraseology. Take it for what it is. But how could we understand Occam's razor in a more simple way of thinking about it? Well, one of a really good way of understanding Occam's razor, at least in my opinion, was reference to an old Vsauce video. So Vsauce, of course, is a very famous YouTuber who makes a number of various videos about interesting things, generally speaking. And he was talking about a theory within ontology and a theory within philosophy more generally, known as last Thursdayism. Now, what last Thursdayism tells us is that it is a belief, a philosophical belief, that the universe, the world that we live on right now, all of our memories, everything that exists in the world in reality was created last Thursday. This is what last Thursdayism tells us, okay? And fundamentally, the problem with last Thursdayism is that it is fundamentally unfalsifiable. You cannot prove it to be wrong. You also cannot prove it to be right either, because any evidence that you can call up as being part of evidence against the idea of last Thursdayism could automatically then just form part of the conspiracy, shall we say, that everything was created last Thursday. So, for example, if I say, well, things can't have been created last Thursday because I have memories of when I was 10 years old, and that was longer than last Thursday. Well, a last Thursdayist, somebody who believes in this particular theory, would say, well, that may be the case, but those memories, your memories of that, came into existence last Thursday. The complete state of reality and the state of existence all came into existence last Thursday. And fundamentally, there is nothing that you can say to prove that that is wrong, or even to prove that that is right. It is unfalsifiable. Now, the way in which a philosopher would tackle these kinds of problems is to resort to an understanding of Occam's razor. Because given the fact that, according to Occam's razor, we should not multiply entities beyond their necessity, we're essentially doing what Quine is suggesting. We are looking for the simplest conceptual scheme. What is more simple? What requires fewest assumptions, the fewest number of assumptions? A, the idea that the universe developed in the way that we understand it did 13.8 billion years ago. Over time, planets began to emerge, and that history began to develop as we know it, and that my 10 years birthday, or whatever it was, happened when I was 10 years old, and many years have passed since then, and we are now talking about this conversation now. Is that more likely than the idea that everything came into existence last Thursday? According to Occam's razor, the former is far more simple in terms of a conceptual scheme than the latter, because what you have to do with the latter is make a number of assumptions. You have to assume that everything that we know about time is wrong. You have to assume that everything that we know about the past didn't actually happen. They all just came into existence last Thursday. And so these multiple assumptions will push one and direct an individual to be more likely to be inclined to understand the most simple conceptual scheme. That's one way of understanding Occam's razor fundamentally. I want to finish then on this idea of sparse ontology. Okay, Quine. This is finally what we're going to talk about in terms of a Quinean method of ontological commitments. Quine did believe that we should be attracted to this idea of what he calls sparse ontology. An ontology, a type of ontology that posits a small number of types of entities, that really doesn't make too many bold statements and make too many crazy and wild ideas relating to the commitments of me to my commitment, should I say, to a my commitments to a number of different things that we want to believe in. He believed that we should be limiting, insofar as possible, our commitments to as many things as possible. And we can obviously contrast this with what is known as abundant ontology. An abundant ontology, of course, posits a large number of assumptions rather than a shorter number of assumptions. Quine believes that you should move closer towards the idea of sparse ontology, mainly as a matter of taste. sorry, not as a matter of taste, but as a genuine method of philosophical inquiry. He argues that the more entities that you can have an ontological commitment towards, the more assumptions you have to make about reality in order to do so, and the further away you are actually getting from actually being able to hold in your hand, if you will, the views of Occam's razor, the idea of making things as conceptually simple as humanly possible.